Welcome to our Friends of Eckhart group podcast number 4. We have 3 people around the table today, and the format for today is a little different. A group dialogue will focus on one single topic: humour and defensiveness in spirituality. And we'll just circle around the topic from different viewpoints. I think the defensiveness, whether it's spirituality or on a wider field, it's coming from a sense of your sense of identity is under threat. And it's usually a thought-created sense of identity. In spirituality, you identify with an organized religion or a spiritual group. You can see evidence of this if you're watching the news in the part of the world we call the Holy Land. It's quite common for people, maybe in Palestine and Israel, when they get together to discuss things, quite often they don't allow one another to finish a sentence because the sense of identity is under threat. Humour and spirituality, the image that comes to mind for me is the Chinese Buddha. He's a big smile, he's the big fat belly, and he's full of laughter. When people come to him with all their problems, serious problems, you can see that they're creating problems for themselves. The problems are really based on illusions. Again, thought-created problems. So that's just to start the ball rolling. I think we'll move over to Bernard.
Well, and of course, in humour, there can be a good teacher as well for spirituality, particularly if you think of those sort of paradoxical tales of the Mullah Nasruddin, which are quite profound teachings in many ways, but it's very hard not to chuckle when you hear them. And also in spirituality, I think as people progress along the spiritual path, there is a growing sense of lightness that comes, and also a sense of humour, almost about the absurdity of the human condition, really, and and how we handle it. But going back to the defensiveness, when I worked a lot with traditional Chinese acupuncture, which was to do very much with the 5 Chinese elements, and we would diagnose people according to what we perceived to be their elemental imbalance on all levels. The people who we diagnosed with the fire element, sometimes they would present with a lot of humour, but it was a defensive humour. It was like a wall of fire, and you knew very well that on the other side of that, there was probably a lot of vulnerability. People would present, perhaps they'd been hurt in relationship, and then the wall of fire would come up, and everything would be batted off with a joke. But you could tell that the humour that was being used as a defensiveness, it was surface, there was something brittle about it. But on the other hand, I think the real humour that's not defensiveness is the real belly laugh that involves the whole person. And when that comes, I think that's when people give themselves in the humour. But I think that it can be used to keep people at a distance and to protect one's own vulnerability.
Spirituality and humour. What comes to mind for me is I used to work as a mental health practitioner. Used to run groups for people who are really quite depressed and anxious, and sometimes with specific problems like sexual abuse in childhood. And you would often find in those, what you would think would be the most difficult groups for people to be in, that actually the humour was really quite near the surface, and it actually helped the groups along. It helped people interact and to lose their inhibitions and be able to talk about things that had been really crushing for them in their lives, and they knew that they were in a safe space. And I think that can be a function of laughter and deep communication, which, is after all what spirituality is about. And a shared sense of oneness with other human beings.
Well, Bernard mentioned Nasruddin, so I used to read Nasruddin stories to my daughter. At least 200 or 300 of these stories, and every night I read them, she would say, "Could you tell me another one? Could you tell me another one?" And it was only many years later that I realised that I've actually educated my daughter to be a Sufi. So I'll give you a Nasruddin story. Nasruddin's a character who's been around for 1,000 years or more, similar to the island's most famous composer, Anonymous, who's also been around for 1,000 years. In this story, Nasruddin gets a job on a building site, and when it comes to the lunch break, he opens up his lunchbox and takes one bite out of the sandwich and throws it away in disgust. And the next day, the same thing happens. Lunch break, open the lunchbox, one bite out of the tuna sandwich, throws it away in disgust. And this goes on for the whole week. And at the end of the week, his fellow workers gather around and say, "Nasruddin, we've been watching you all week. You really have to get your wife to make more interesting sandwiches." And Nasruddin says, "That's not so simple. You see, I don't have a wife. I make these sandwiches myself." And there's a deeper aspect to that, as well as maybe smiling at the end. It reminded me of the teacher called Ajashanti saying, "Have you noticed that it's always other people who create problems?"
Of course, you've triggered a story in me. It's not, I don't know whether it's a Nasruddin story, but it's certainly a story from the East of this man, really holy man, who was very much revered by all the community. And every time they went to him and asked him how he had attained his great wisdom, he only had one answer, and he said, "I know what is in the Quran." It didn't matter who came, that was the answer. "I know what is in the Quran." And one day, a rather sort of stupid man came up who wasn't particularly on the spiritual path and said to him, "You're always saying to us that you're so wise because you know what is in the Quran. What is in the Quran?" And he bowed and he said, "There are 2 pressed flowers and a letter from my friend Abdullah." And that is a wonderful story about levels, really. And of course, there are levels with all these things. And I was just thinking that I know that the further I've gone on this path, my humour, my sense of humour has changed, and things that I used to find funny, I don't find funny anymore. In fact, I often find them very upsetting and disturbing. And But then I suppose I have my humour, I stand back a lot more, and my humour is more about the predicament that we're all in, really.
I'm thinking back to my experience of going to see Krishnamurti speaking, and he quite often would relate some joke or other which it lightened the proceedings. It was usually a particular joke about a person going along the road and they saw something shiny and they pick it up, and the devil comes up beside the person and says, "What's that you found?" And he says, "Well, it's part of truth." And the devil says, "Well, I'll help you organise it." And of course, Krishnamurti told this joke for about 60 years probably. And I noticed in his later talks when he would say, "Would you like to hear a joke?" Quite often he'd tell that joke and nobody would laugh. And he said, "Well, it's up to you. Just say yourselves." As if no one had a sense of humour. So.
Yeah, I had a friend, this is a few years back, he's walking down the high street and there's a little bookshop, and he looks in the window, and centre stage is a very large book, a very thick book, and it's called How to Win Arguments. And then 3 months later, he's walking down the high street again, looks in the little bookshop window, centre stage, very large book, How to Win Arguments, Volume 2. And when I looked up the internet to see if he was working on Volume 3, I found there was more than 20 books with similar titles. So anyone who's interested in winning arguments, there's plenty of conceptual ammunition out there. There's a Scottish writer called Ian McGilchrist. I quite like what he points out. As an example, he would talk about a blackbird and how the bird has to bow down to catch the worm, and that requires a narrow vision. At the same time, it has to be aware that a predator may jump on its back while it's picking up the worm. So that's the wide, all-encompassing awareness. And what Ian is pointing out is that most of us have lost touch with this wider, all-encompassing, where education tends to focus on the narrow. And when you see people in a state of anger, you can see how narrow that channel is. I've witnessed two people at a street corner, maybe a man and wife, are shouting at one another. And usually they were both shouting, "I am not angry." And there was a group of people round about them, but they didn't know the existence of that group of people because they were on a very narrow focus, rather than the wider focus. So that comes into the defensiveness. When you're in that very narrow focus, you're less open to humour, because humour requires the flexibility. You think the end of the story is going to go that way, and it goes a different way. It changes direction. And I have, over the years, I've never heard many terrorist crack jokes. So I think for younger people listening to this, pay attention to the importance of all-encompassing awareness, not just the awareness of the tree or the bush or the building, but the all-encompassing awareness. Gavin mentioned Krishnamurti dialogues. He does a dialogue with Professor Anderson. Professor Anderson can sense the awareness in the room as they're having the dialogue, and he says everything flows, all the microphones, everything is going on around him, because there is that harmony. Everything is taken care of from the wider intelligence. We sometimes forget that presence is an intelligence.
I haven't got much to add, except I'd like to share my favourite joke about transformation. Now, these two caterpillars walking down the road, having a very gloomy conversation, and this beautiful butterfly flitted along across their paths. And one caterpillar looked at the other and said, "You'll never get me up in one of those things."
Sometimes when you have what we call a spiritual group meeting, it can descend into chaos, especially if you're talking about subjects like inner peace, and everybody starts arguing about inner peace. And you get the opposite. You switch on your YouTube video, as I did 2 weeks ago, and there's two comedians having a conversation. One of them is called Stephen Wright. The conversation moves to, Stephen says that his mother treats him like a 6-year-old child, even though he's in his late 50s. And he says, to give an example, he says, if I was the most famous astronaut on the planet, I was waving to all the television screens on the planet Earth. As soon as I come back down to Earth and went to visit my mother, she would say, "Wipe your feet on the mat. We don't want any moon dust on the carpets." So that was the level of conversation. And Stephen happened to say, he's speaking about galaxies, and he says, the only thing it does my head in is infinity. And the younger man next to him says, I always think of awareness as being infinity. And that surprised me, coming in the middle of a light-hearted conversation about comedy. That is really worth pondering on. Another story on the comedy I quite like is I have a friend, Anne, she runs these psychic development groups at the Athercon and Doyle Centre in Edinburgh, the city that's near to us. And she got a group of a dozen people in a circle. She was ready to start a group meeting, and there was a leakage. Water was coming down from the ceiling. She realised she would have to move the group She explained to people, we need to move down to the basement. You go down to street level, there's a flight of stairs takes you to a basement room. And while she's explaining to people and people are getting ready to move, there's a telephone call. And the woman said, my husband's coming, but he's late and he's coming direct from his work. He wants to be part of the group, but he's got his working clothes on. Is it okay if he comes with working clothes? And Anne says, yeah, that's fine, but tell him to come to the basement, not to come to the first floor meeting. So she goes down to the basement, but this time the meeting's 15 minutes behind schedule. She gets everybody in a circle. She said, we're just going to go straight into the meditation. And as she's talking, the man with the working clothes comes down the stairs. She says, look, just sit in the middle. We're going to go directly. Sits down. She says, be aware of the breath, be aware of the body. She paints a picture of the palm trees, relax. She has the music on her mobile phone. 3 minutes of meditation. And then when she finishes, she says, I hope you all feel at peace. And the man says, I think there's some mistake. He says, I've come here to repair the boiler. So this is humour and spirituality. I think the defensiveness is an important topic because you can see not only do people go to argument, but in certain parts of the world, if you don't agree with someone else's story, you could be in great danger. They could even kill you. Because these storylines are especially to do with organised religion, but also spiritual groups, because the organised religion gathers beliefs that are not to be questioned, And there's emotion through these belief systems. And so certain statements can actually trigger a response, And of course, the same thing happens in politics. And so it's important when you're holding a spiritual group meeting to be aware of the difference between the reality of a spiritual group meeting and the words on the surface. I'll read this little quotation that comes from the spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle. Nothing strengthens the ego more than being right. Being right is identification with a mental position, a perspective, an opinion, a judgment, a story. For you to be right, of course, you need someone else to be wrong, and so the ego loves to make wrong. So there are many spiritual gatherings which actually deteriorate into egocentric gatherings. And it's really important to know the mechanism of the ego. That quotation comes from a book called The New Earth, which has been in existence for more than 20 years. And 2/3 of the book is pointing out the mechanics of the ego and the tricks of the ego. And it's really helpful to know these. And so when you're in the company of someone who's extremely egocentric, you can see it's a pattern. And it helps you to be free of a reactivity from getting sucked into the pattern. And the person who's speaking to you senses there's something different when you're not caught up in this reactionary field. So we've touched on some humour and we've touched on defensiveness. Have we got another one statement before we go on to the next?
I was thinking it's a specific thing about the comedian Billy Connolly. He's a well-known comedian, probably worldwide. Most people would know him. Born in Scotland, fairly difficult background in the slum area of Glasgow, and a lot of difficulties when he was growing up. And his humour developed in a way where he was born Catholic, and there's, particularly in this country in the 60s, there was a kind of divide between the Catholic sect of Christianity and Protestantism, and it created a lot of tension and a lot of defensiveness around particular beliefs that were held by each faction. And Billy Connolly, and people who live in Scotland would know this, he tended to ignore those taboos, and he would talk openly about these situations to the extent that he developed a story about Jesus' life and his progression from birth to being crucified, and ended up in a comedy routine around the crucifixion. Of course, that was very difficult for some people in the Catholic Church in particular to hear about that, hear that being discussed in a humorous manner. But historically, probably looking back, that was the beginning of a lot of the undoing of divisions and secularism within Scottish society. And to the extent that probably throughout UK, people are able to laugh at the religion while they actually hold those beliefs, if they do hold maybe even quite dogmatic beliefs, they can still sort of laugh at themselves more openly than they used to. And I really think it's something that is acknowledged enough that comedians have had quite a big role in this country in breaking down those taboos and to help people acknowledge, well, it's just a belief, what's the truth behind it? And there actually is a truth behind it. And comedy can actually uncover the truth quite easily and quite quickly. So I think historically, looking back, people will acknowledge that humour has had quite a part to play. And to an extent, also with different cultures and Islam in Scotland, there are sketch shows on the television that show interactions between Islamic people and Scottish people and their different backgrounds. And again, they're able to laugh at each other. And I think that's helped in a lot of areas.
Just some things came to mind as Gavin's been speaking there. I don't know this in detail, but I've heard that when Christianity, around about the 3rd century, it was edited by the church. One of the first statements to go was, Jesus laughed. They didn't like that because it seemed to be too trivial. It wasn't solemn enough. It wasn't serious enough, And I mentioned the difference when you're listening to teachers, people use words in a different way. Eckhart Tolle would speak about don't take your thoughts too seriously. And Krishnamurti would say that you need to be serious, not flippant. You have to. I would use the word dedicated. I like the phrase dedicated to being. So my contribution, people are using the word in different ways, so you get to know how they're using the word. But my take on it is don't become too serious about your seriousness. And the humour is really important. In fact, I don't think that you can get a truly enlightened person who doesn't have a sense of humour.
Going back to what Gavin said, I think that ability to not take oneself too seriously and to stand back and be able to hold one's beliefs and whatever and laugh, it's quite a simple and easy and uncompromising way to extract yourself from the duality, because in order to be able to laugh at it, you have to pull yourself back into that other place, which we need to be in so much more of the time generally, really.
Yeah, I would just say that in that other place is the presence behind the words, the presence behind the words that you're hearing at this moment. And that presence is the same for all people around this table, the reality of that. I think we'll now go on to a poem from Bernard.
Just a little quote from the Tao Te Ching. In the pursuit of learning, every day something is acquired. In the pursuit of Tao, every day something is dropped. I've got a little poem. This poem is written by a Scottish poet, a friend of mine, Sheila Templeton, who sadly passed away last year. She and I were for many years in an Indian meditation organization where there was a guru, which is a dirty word these days, now known as perhaps the guide or a teacher. So, and he had the wonderful name of Parthasarati Rajagopalachari. He was known as Chari for short. And I only mention that because he's actually mentioned in this poem. This poem, it's really a woman's poem. I mean, Sheila read it beautifully, so you'll just have to put up with me. And it's called Living with Mrs. Ego. We live together, Mrs. Ego and me, have done for years. She fancies herself as a bit of a housekeeper. Think hyacinth bouquet crossed with Hitler. I've mainly let her be. Prefer the quiet life. Everything was fine, on the whole, apart from an occasional do over space and stuff. Like I said, a quiet life. Until the day I invited Master in for tea. There she stood at the door, doorbell shining, carpets brushed, no dust, no spiders, apron off, the perfect hostess. In strode Chariji, smiling his smile at her. That smile, looking with those eyes softly, yet seeing straight through everything, her, me, our house. She didn't stand a chance. Before she could stop him, he'd opened the hall cupboard, then the one under the stairs. Well, the dirt and cobwebs and the weeping and wailing. There was no stuffing stuff back either. It wouldn't go. It wouldn't fit. There was nothing for it but to clean everything as it sat there. Dusters and mops and brasso. And what couldn't clean, out it all went, so the neighbours saw everything. Oh, my! Then Master sat in the living room, drinking his tea and smiling that smile. Me, as close as I could get to him, passing the shortbread. Now Mrs. Ego is sulking in the kitchen, her apron over her head. It'll all end in tears, you mark my words. He says he hasn't started on the attic. Then there's the cellar, and what about the rubbish in the garden shed? Not to mention all the stuff she's been hiding under my bed for years. She can kick up as much as she likes. There's a better smell around the place these days. He's here to stay.
Just to conclude our theme for today, it came to my mind. I had a next-door neighbour who played double bass jazz, one of the best jazz bass players in Scotland. And there was a film on the television called The Fisher King. And we both walked down the stairs and met one another face to face, and I says to him, wasn't it a wonderful film? And at the same time he says, wasn't it a terrible film? And we both burst out laughing. So that shows you more important than the concepts on the surface is the underlying friendship. So I'm going to finish up with a little poem. It's from an Irish author called John O'Donoghue, and it's called The Irish Blessing, delivered with a Scots accent. On the day when the weight deadens on your shoulders and you stumble, may the day dance to balance you. And when your eyes freeze behind the grey window and the ghost of loss gets into you, may a flock of colours, indigo, red, green and azure blue, come to awaken you to a meadow of delight. When the canvas frays and the currach of thought and a stain of ocean blackens beneath you, may there come across the waters a path of yellow moonlight to bring you safely home. May the nourishment of the earth be yours. May the clarity of the light be yours. May the fluency of the ocean be yours. May the protection of the ancestors be yours. And so may a slow wind work these words around you in an invisible cloak to guide your life, to bless the space between us. The Irish Blessing, John O'Donoghue. Thank you.